everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today. And in particular, because I get to ask you essentially my favorite question that I ever ask anyone. And that's, what does a brand mean to you? And typically when I ask people what a brand means to them, they think about going grocery shopping and finding the product that they bought the week before that they tasted and tried and liked. And there's a visual identifier on a package that tells them, hey, this is the product I bought last week, I really liked it, and I'm going to purchase it again. And of course, that is a piece of what brands are. But what I'd like to tell you a little bit about tonight is the work that we're doing in our lab that investigates what brands do much beyond that, all right? Why is this an interesting and important question? How many brand exposures do you think the typical American gets exposed to in a day? Everybody got a number in their head? 3,000 to 10,000 are the typical, or the latest estimates, okay? So we're getting exposed to 3,000 to 10,000 brand exposures in a day. You get up, you open the fridge, boom, there's 60. Close the door, open the cupboard, there's another 30, okay? Just go on. Do these have any meaning to us? Are they having any impact? These are the kinds of research questions that my students and I like to ask. I like to draw an analogy to icebergs when I think about brands, all right? Has anybody ever seen an iceberg, just a show of hands? All right, it's a pretty amazing thing, all right? It's this majestic, often massive piece of ice that's floating out there in the middle of the ocean. What's actually more impressive about icebergs than that tip of the iceberg is what's happening beneath the water. There's this huge amount of ice underneath the surface of the water, all right? Brands are the same thing, or that's the argument that my lab and I like to make. On the surface is the brand, is the logo, the physical identifier that tells you which product you bought last week and which one you want to buy this week. Underneath the surface, there's much more going on. And what I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about some of the work that my students and I have done investigating this question. To do so, we're going to draw and borrow from an association that one of the world's biggest companies has built with its brand, all right? So how many of you guys are Apple users? Just a show of hands. A huge number of us, okay. Even if you're not an Apple user, you still have an association between Apple and a certain personality trait, creativity. We've seen the Think Different campaigns. We've seen the original iPod campaigns. Apple has spent a lot of money to build a link in our minds between Apple and creativity. Our research question is, does this do anything? Does it change us in any way? If you see a glimpse of someone walking by you on the street and they have a phone at their ear, you maybe notice that there's a person walking by, probably don't really notice they're talking on the phone, almost certainly don't notice the brand of the phone at a conscious level. Yet that's one of those 3,000 to 10,000 brand exposures you're getting hit with in a day. Is it changing your behavior, your life in any meaningful way? That's the question. What we're going to do is we're going to use a research technique called subliminal priming. Latin for sub meaning below and liminal meaning threshold. We're going to expose you to a brand logo below your conscious threshold. You don't realize you're going to be exposed to this brand, and then we're going to look to see if this non-conscious exposure to the brand changes you and your behavior in any meaningful way. So there'll be 3 groups, all right? Imagine I split the room into 3 groups. One group gets exposed outside their conscious awareness to an Apple logo. One group gets exposed to an IBM logo, and one group doesn't get exposed to a logo at all. And then I'm going to observe your behavior, the 3 groups, okay? What you think you're seeing is a box on a screen, and I say, listen, I'd like you to tell me whether the box appears on the left or right of the screen. You sit in front of a computer, you press left, right. So you think you see left, you say left. You think you see right, you say right. Great, very easy. What you're actually seeing is a box, a brand exposure, and a box. It's happening so quickly that you don't realize you're being exposed to that Apple logo. For the sort of fans in the audience, somewhere in the 10 millisecond range is how quickly we're exposing you to this brand logo, all right? Now, the question is, does that do anything? How are we going to test if it does anything to you? Well, I mentioned that Apple is strongly associated with this creativity trait in all of our minds. I'm going to test your creativity, and I'm going to do it by giving you a task called the unusual uses task. I give you a brick, and I ask you to generate as many uses for a brick as you can. The more uses you generate, the more creative you're being. So what would you do if you had a brick other than building a building? Shout them out so I can hear. Doorstop. Bookends. All right, etc. I heard a couple of violent ones, but I'm going to let those ones go. All right. Again, the more uses you generate, the more creative you're being. The group that just saw the boxes with no brand exposure generate about 6 uses for a brick. The folks that got exposed to the IBM logo outside their conscious awareness actually become slightly less creative. Apologies to the IBMers. If I expose you to an Apple brand logo outside your conscious awareness, you actually become more creative, all right? Across a whole bunch of studies and a whole bunch of different ways and different measures of creativity, et cetera, non-conscious exposure to the Apple logo actually increases your creativity somewhere on the order of about 30%. All right, so one little example of the role that brands might be having in our lives outside our conscious awareness. The second one I thought I'd tell you a little bit about some of the work we're doing in this space is by asking you the question, who do you turn to at the end of a long day? Has everybody got somebody in mind? Hopefully. I'm going to suggest that perhaps that's not who you turn to. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second. There's lots of interesting work that's been done that has shown that when we have limited financial resources, we often have large social networks. So I grew up in a relatively poor household, poor financially, but we had a huge social network. When someone built a fence on our street, I was out there digging the fence posts with that horrible tool. Have you ever done it with the 2 shovel things and pull it apart? If you've done it, you know what I'm talking about. When somebody did something, everybody pitched in. As we grow in financial resources, we know that our social networks shrink. When you need to have a fence built now, who builds your fence? Someone that you pay to build a fence, okay? Your social network shrinks as your financial resources go up. So, what happens then? So we know what happens when someone with limited financial resources has a bad day. Who do they turn to? They're turning to their social others. What about folks that have high resources? Who do they turn to at the end of a bad day? Delicious, right? What do I get every time I have a sip of my Diet Coke? I get a little boost of positive energy. Is it reliable? Every time I feel kind of bad and I have a sip of my Diet Coke, I get a reliable positive boost. What happens when I turn to, say, my lovely wife at the end of a bad day? I often hear, oh, you think you had a bad day. Wait till you hear about my bad day, right? Okay. We've found that as our financial resources increase, more and more we turn to brands instead of other people. We turn to brands at the end of a bad day instead of our relationship partners to a very significant degree, all right? So those are 2 little tidbits of the roles that brands might play in our lives. What I hope to communicate and give you a little tidbit about here tonight is that, the work that my students and I have been doing have shown that brands are obviously very frequently encountered objects in our lives. They have deeper roles and meaning in our lives than we might think, and they can be helpful at times, right? If you want to be creative, perhaps being exposed to these brands could lead you to be more creative, all right? Hopefully, this little snippet of our work might suggest to you that you have to select the brands that you surround yourself with in life very, very carefully, because the associations that you hold with those brands are going to literally change your behavior, all right? So I hope, at least, that there's one brand that we can all come to agreement around that we should have be even more central to our lives, and that, not surprisingly, is Duke. Thank you.